The diner closed at 11, but Maeve Larkin was still there at midnight, wiping down the same stretch of counter she'd already wiped twice. Not because it was dirty. Because going home meant sitting alone in an apartment that still smelled like her mother's lavender soap, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She almost didn't hear the bell above the door. Almost. The man who walked in wasn't the kind of man who belonged in a place like Kepler's all-night diner on the edge of Highway 11 in Sudbury, Ontario. He wore a coat that cost more than Maeve made in 2 months. His shoes were the kind that didn't leave marks on wet pavement, and he moved through the door like he owned the building, the block, and everything attached to it. But none of that was what stopped Maeve cold. It was the boy he was carrying. The child couldn't have been more than 7, limp in the man's arms, head dropped against his shoulder, face the color of old wax. The man's jaw was set like stone, but his eyes, dark, scanning, calculating, gave him away. He was scared. He just didn't know how to show it. "I need a phone," he said. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice people used when they were keeping everything together by sheer force of will. "And I need someone who knows what they're doing. The boy needs help." Maeve Larkin had been a waitress for 6 years. She'd handled drunk truckers, domestic arguments, a cardiac arrest in booth 4, and one very memorable summer when a black bear walked through the propped-open back door looking for pie. She did not panic easily. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. "Stay with me until the end, because what happened next in that diner, what Maeve did, and what it cost her, and what this man did to repay it, changed everything for both of them. And I mean everything. But first, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. We've got listeners tonight from all over, and I want to know where you are. Now, let's go back to that diner. Maeve didn't know who the man was. She didn't know his name, didn't know the black SUV idling in the parking lot with 2 men standing outside it, didn't know that half the law enforcement agencies in Northern Ontario had a file with his photograph in it. All she knew was a child who wasn't breathing right. "Lay him down," she said, pointing to the long booth along the far wall. "Flat, don't prop his head." The man hesitated, just for a second, like he wasn't used to taking directions from someone in a green apron with a coffee stain on the sleeve. "Now," Maeve said, "please." He laid the boy down. His name was Sebastian Holt. Maeve didn't know that either, not yet. What she knew was that the child's lips had a faint blue tinge, and his breathing was shallow and uneven, and that the small medikit she kept behind the counter, the one her manager mocked her for bringing every shift, had exactly what she needed. "Does he have allergies?" she asked, already pulling open the kit. "Not that I know of." "You don't know." Something flickered across the man's face. "He's my nephew. I haven't been around as much as I should have been." Maeve didn't have time to unpack that sentence. She checked the boy's pulse, tilted his airway gently, checked his pupils. Uneven, one slightly larger than the other. She reached for her phone. "I'm calling 911. "No." The word came out fast, then quieter. "Not yet, please. Just tell me what's wrong with him first." Maeve looked up at the man. Really looked at him. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples. A scar ran along his jaw, thin and old. His hands were steady, but he was gripping the edge of the booth like it was the only solid thing in the world. "He needs a hospital," she said. "Whatever I can do here is temporary. I know. I just need 5 minutes." 5 minutes. Maeve had heard that before. She'd heard it from her father every time he promised to cut back on the drinking, every time he said he'd just need 5 more minutes before he came inside. 5 minutes that stretched into hours, into years, into a whole childhood spent waiting on a porch. She looked at the boy, then she looked at the man. 4 minutes, she said, and then I'm calling. She worked fast. The boy, she'd find out later his name was Jamie Holt, 7 years old, his father dead and his mother in a hospital in Timmins, fighting something she probably wouldn't win, had gone into a hypoglycemic episode, diabetic. Maeve had her glucose tabs in the kit. She'd bought them after her mother was diagnosed 2 years ago, carried them ever since out of habit. She got 2 tabs into the boy's cheek, monitored his breathing, kept his airway clear. 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, Jamie Holt opened his eyes. The man let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. Hey buddy, Maeve said softly, smoothing the boy's hair back from his forehead. You gave us a scare. Can you tell me how you feel? Tired, the boy whispered. Then, looking past her at the man, Uncle Cade, I'm here, the man said. His voice had changed entirely. Everything hard in it had dissolved. I'm right here, James. Maeve stood up and stepped back to give them space. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She called 911 anyway, quietly, from the kitchen, so the boy wouldn't hear. Gave them the location, described the situation, listened to the dispatcher walk her through what to watch for. By the time she hung up and came back out front, the man, Uncle Cade, was sitting in the booth beside Jamie, one large hand resting carefully over the boy's small one. He looked up when Maeve came back. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than that. Something that looked almost like grief. Thank you, he said. The ambulance is 12 minutes out, Maeve said. She poured a glass of orange juice and set it on the table. Get some of that into him when he can sit up. Small sips, you called them. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Okay. The ambulance came. The paramedics came. And with them, eventually, 2 men from the black SUV who stood near the door and watched everything with the kind of careful stillness that Maeve had learned, growing up in a house with an unpredictable father, meant they were ready to move fast if they needed to. One of the paramedics recognized the man. Maeve could tell by the way the woman's posture changed when she got close. The subtle shift, the careful neutrality that people used when they were trying very hard to behave, as though they hadn't noticed something important. Maeve noticed. She was good at noticing. She stood behind the counter and watched them load Jamie onto a stretcher, watched the man sign something the paramedic handed him, watched him exchange a few quiet words with the 2 men from the parking lot. Then he turned and walked back toward the counter. He set down a card. Plain white, no logo, just a phone number printed in small black type. If you ever need anything, he said. Maeve looked at the card, then at him. What's your name? Another pause, like he was deciding something. Caden Holt, he said. She filed the name away somewhere in the back of her mind and forgot about it. Or she tried to. The thing about a name like that, she'd find out later, was that once you heard it in certain circles, you didn't forget it no matter how hard you tried. Caden Holt, 43 years old, born in Thunder Bay, built an empire from the ground up in the years after his older brother died and left behind a business that was, depending on who you asked, either a logistics company or the backbone of organized operations across most of northern and central Ontario. The kind of man who drove through Sudbury at midnight with his sick nephew in his arms because the boy's mother was dying in a hospital 2 hours away, and Caden Holt didn't trust anyone else to get James there safely. Maeve didn't know any of that. Not yet. She just went home, sat down on her couch in her mother's lavender soap apartment, and thought about a little boy whose lips had gone blue and the way a very controlled man had gripped the edge of a booth like it was the only thing keeping him upright. She thought about it for a long time before she fell asleep. 3 weeks later, 2 men she'd never seen before came into Kepler's diner during the lunch rush and sat in her section. They were polite. They ordered coffee and soup. They tipped well. And one of them, while she was refilling his cup, said quietly and without looking up, "You saved Caden Holt's nephew. He hasn't forgotten." Maeve set the coffee pot down carefully. "I just did basic first aid. You called 911 when he asked you not to. A child needed a hospital." The man looked up then. His eyes were pale, attentive, completely without warmth. "That's an interesting choice you made. Most people don't make that choice." Maeve didn't know what to do with that, so she said the only thing she could think of. "Is the boy okay?" Something shifted in the man's expression. Something small and human. "He's okay," he said. "He's home." They finished their coffee and left. The tip was $200 in cash, folded under the saucer. Maeve stood there, holding it for a long time, the lunch rush moving around her like water around a stone. She should have put the number from the card in the trash. She knew that. Whatever world Caden Holt moved in, it was not a world she needed to be adjacent to. She had a shift at 6, a dentist appointment on Thursday, and a box of her mother's things in the hall closet she hadn't been able to open yet. She had enough. But then, 2 days later, someone slashed her tires in the parking lot behind the diner. And the day after that, someone broke the window of her car. And the day after that, she found an envelope taped to her apartment door with a photograph inside it. Her, coming out of Kepler's, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. No note, just the photograph. Maeve sat on her couch in her coat with her keys still in her hand and tried to think clearly. She wasn't the kind of woman who scared easily. She'd grown up learning to read rooms, to measure silences, to know when the atmosphere in a house had changed. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was a message. She pulled out the plain white card. She stared at it for 10 minutes. Then she called the number. He answered on the second ring. Maeve Larkin, Caden Holt said. Like he'd been expecting her. Like her name in his mouth was something he'd rehearsed. Someone's been following me, she said. She kept her voice level. She was proud of that. I think it started after your nephew came into my diner. Silence. Then, when did it start? 4 days ago. Slashed tires first, then my car window, then a photograph of me outside work. She heard something on the other end of the line that might have been a chair being pushed back. Might have been a door being opened. Are you home right now? Yes? Stay there. Don't open the door for anyone until I call you back. I'm not going to just Maeve, her name again, still measured, but with something under it now. Something that could have been urgency or guilt or both. Please. I'll explain everything. Just give me 30 minutes. She almost hung up. She thought about it. But outside her window, a dark car had been parked on the street for the past 2 hours with its engine off, and the person inside hadn't moved. 30 minutes, she said. He told her the truth. That was the part she hadn't expected. He arrived in 22 minutes, with 2 of his people, swept her building in a way that suggested they'd done it before, and sat down across from her, at her kitchen table, like it was the most natural thing in the world. One of his people, a quiet woman named Ida, who wore her hair in a tight braid and moved like someone who had trained for things Maeve didn't want to think about, stayed by the front door. There's a man named Ferris Dale, Caden said. He said the name carefully, like he was handing her something fragile and possibly dangerous. He and I have a history. About 2 years ago, he made a move against my family. It didn't go well for him. He's been looking for leverage ever since. And I'm leverage, Maeve said. Caden looked at her without flinching. You saved my nephew's life. That makes you valuable to people who want to hurt me. I'm a waitress from Sudbury. You're someone Caden Holt owes a debt to, he said. In certain worlds, that's worth a great deal. Maeve thought about that. Thought about the photograph on her door, the dark car outside, the $200 tip that had felt less like gratitude and more. She understood now, like a marker, a flag planted, something that said, this woman is connected to something. So what happens now? She asked. Now I fix it. What does fixing it look like? Caden's jaw tightened slightly. Nothing you need to worry about. It's my apartment, Maeve said. My tires, my car window, my photograph. I think I'm entitled to worry about it. He looked at her again with that expression she couldn't quite name. The one that wasn't exactly gratitude and wasn't exactly grief, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone easier to manage. Maeve almost smiled. I've been told that before. She didn't go back to the diner for a week. Caden Holt's people moved her to a clean apartment on the other side of the city, while they sorted out the situation with Ferris Dale, which Maeve understood to mean things she was better off not knowing in detail. Ida stayed with her. They played cards in the evenings. Ida was terrible at rummy and refused to admit it. On the third night, Jamie Holt came to visit. He was small for 7, with dark eyes like his uncle's and a smile that was nothing like his uncle's, wide and easy and completely unguarded. He walked in wearing a yellow raincoat and carrying a drawing he'd made at school, which he presented to Maeve with great ceremony. It's you, he said, pointing to a figure in green. And that's Uncle Cade. And that's me. I made yours the biggest because you're the most important. Maeve looked at the drawing. 3 figures in crayon, standing in front of a building that might have been a diner, or might have been a castle, or might have been both. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. Caden stood in the doorway watching his nephew present the drawing, with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to situations that made his chest feel like that. Like something was trying to get out. His mother is improving, he said, when Jamie had gone to inspect Maeve's kitchen for snacks. The treatment is working. They think she'll be out by spring. That's good, Maeve said. She wants to meet you, Maeve looked at him. Why? Because Jamie talks about you every day, Caden said. He calls you the lady who fixed him. He paused. And because I told her what you did, that you called the ambulance even when I asked you not to, you were going to call one eventually. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. I'm not always good at asking for help. No, Maeve said. You're really not. Something crossed his face then. Something that looked, briefly, like relief, like a man who'd been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just set it down for a moment to rest. He's going to be okay, Caden said, and Maeve couldn't tell if he was talking about Jamie or about himself or about something else entirely. I know, she said. Ferris Dale was arrested 11 days later on charges that had nothing to do with Maeve Larkin and everything to do with a financial investigation that had apparently been building for some time. She read about it in the news over her morning coffee. 3 columns, below the fold, a logistics company, a shell account, a federal task force that had been patient for the better part of a year. She called Caden. You knew about the investigation, she said. You knew it was coming. I knew it was possible, he said carefully. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the first real snow of the year was coming down in thick, quiet sheets over the rooftops of Sudbury, covering everything in white. Fresh start weather, the kind of morning her mother used to love. What happens now? She asked. The same question she'd asked at her kitchen table with Ida at the door. Somehow it felt different now. There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant someone was choosing their words with more care than usual. I'd like to buy you dinner, Caden said. An actual dinner, not a diner at midnight with a medical emergency. Is this you asking? Yes, you're not very good at that either, Maeve said. I'm aware, he said, and she could hear something in his voice then that she hadn't heard before. Something lighter, something that had been there under everything the whole time, but hadn't had room to surface until now. I'm trying to get better at it. Maeve looked at the snow coming down outside her window, thought about a yellow raincoat and a crayon drawing where she was the biggest figure, thought about a man gripping the edge of a booth in a roadside diner like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world. Thursday, she said. I'm off on Thursdays. Thursday, he said. I'll remember. 6 months after a midnight walk-in at Kepler's all-night diner, Jamie Holt's mother came home from the hospital. There was a party. Small, quiet, the kind of gathering that didn't look like much from the outside, but carried the weight of something enormous on the inside. A family finding its way back to something it had almost lost. Maeve was there. She stood in the kitchen, helping Jamie assemble a very ambitious cheese platter, while his mother, Lenore, sat at the table and cried in the good way and said, for the 4th time, that she wished she'd been there that night to thank Maeve herself. You don't have to thank me, Maeve said. I just did what anyone would do. No, Lenore said firmly, you did what you would do. That's different. Across the kitchen, Caden Holt stood leaning in the doorway with a glass of water, watching his nephew arrange crackers into increasingly creative patterns and listening to his sister-in-law tell Maeve Larkin things he hadn't managed to say himself in 6 months of trying. He was not a man who had been good at many soft things. Not gratitude, not asking for help, not letting people close enough to matter. He'd built walls the way other men built careers, deliberately, one layer at a time, until the walls were so high he'd nearly forgotten what was on the other side of them. He hadn't forgotten, he'd just stopped believing it was accessible. Jamie looked up and caught his uncle's eye. Uncle Cade, you're not helping. I'm supervising, Caden said. That's not a job. It's a very important job. Jamie considered this with great seriousness, then appeared to accept it and went back to his crackers. Maeve caught Caden's eye over the top of the boy's head, and she smiled. The quiet kind, not performed for anyone, just real, and something in Caden Holt's chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency over the past 6 months, the thing he had no good language for yet. He was working on it. Some men, The ones who have spent years being the kind of person the world builds stories around. The feared kind, the complicated kind. They forget that the most important things don't happen in dark rooms with phones going at midnight and decisions that cost somebody something. The most important things happen in kitchens, over cheese platters, with children who make crayon drawings where you're not the biggest figure, where someone else is, where someone else earned it. Maeve Larkin went back to work at Kepler's on a Friday morning in early spring. She tied on her green apron, refilled the sugar dispensers, wiped down the counter, and put the kettle on. The regular 7 a.m. crowd started coming in around 7:15, the way they always did. She didn't tell anyone what had happened over the winter. It wasn't really a story she knew how to tell yet, and besides, some things belong to you before they belong to anyone else. But she kept the crayon drawing, framed it even. It hung in her apartment in the hallway, 3 figures in front of a building that was maybe a diner, maybe a castle, maybe both, and the tallest one was her, because a 7-year-old boy had decided, with the unflinching certainty of someone who hasn't learned yet to second-guess such things, that she was the most important one in the picture. She thought about that sometimes. On the hard days, on the days that smelled too much like lavender soap and felt too much like grief. She thought about what it meant for someone to look at you and put you at the center of their picture of the world. It meant you had stayed, when it would have been easier to walk past, to keep wiping down the counter, to let someone else handle it. You had stayed. Not everyone does, but the ones who do, Maeve had learned, those are the ones worth building a picture around. If this story reminded you that the most ordinary people sometimes do the most extraordinary things, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, when was the last time a stranger did something that changed your day? I want to read every single one.